example, scores of New Testament theologies were penned, with separate chapters devoted to, say, the theology of Paul, the theology of the Synoptic Gospels, and so forth. Relatively little thought and space were devoted to how to link those chapters together. The ordering of those chapters was often determined by the scholar's perception of the order in which the biblical corpora had been written. Thus, Paul is before Matthew, and John comes last. Standing athwart these developments was the contribution of Gerhardus Voss. His biblical theology, published in 1948, was shaped not only by his grasp of the temporal dependence biblical theology, but by his insistence that the temporal line should be determined by the progress of the revelatory events of redemptive history, not by the perceived date of when a book had been written. To provide a trivial analogy, when he wrote his great history of World War II, William Shirer showed himself to be a fine historian who was careful with his voluminous sources that were carefully culled in the years immediately after the war. Nevertheless, he sounds a bit different from later historians who wrote their histories after the Korean War, Vietnam, the Cold War, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Many of the later historical judgments differed from those of Shirer, not least because they were the product of the mind of a historian who lived through things that Shirer never experienced. But I cannot too strongly insist that both Shirer and the later writers wrote about World War II, not about the history of the second half of the 20th century. No one could recreate that history from historical writings that claimed to disclose what happened half a century earlier. In the same way, Mark's Gospel may well have been written several decades before John's Gospel, and with care, one can cautiously delineate something of the context in which each evangelist lived. Yet they were writing not to delineate their own contexts, but to talk about Jesus. The insight of Voss was that proper biblical theology should be anchored in the historic development of redemptive history, or, more precisely, in the historic progression of the revelation process. Many have overlooked this emphasis in Voss. Part of the reason is that Voss never fully unpacked what this meant for his reading of the New Testament. O. Palmer Robertson has set himself the task of filling in this lacuna. Having worked hard to trace the revelation process in the Old Testament, he now sets out to do something similar for the New. This is the first volume of a projected multi-volume contribution. I like it enormously. At last, a biblical theologian who simultaneously loves systematic theology and clearly sees the wisdom and insight of Voss's approach. D.A. Carson, Emeritus Professor of New Testament, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. A further word. This is an important book for more than one reason. First is the understanding of biblical theology that Dr. Robertson represents. Among the multiple and often substantially divergent views abroad today, he is committed to advancing the redemptive historical approach of Gerhardus Voss. His concern is not only to preserve an awareness of Voss's own work in biblical theology, or what Voss deemed a more suitable designation, history of special revelation, but also to build and expand on that legacy, as he does in this volume. While there is more than one acceptable way of doing biblical theology, it is fair to observe that a redemptive historical approach, like that of Voss, followed by Robertson, enjoys an explicit biblical warrant that sets it apart from others. That warrant is found in the opening words of the Epistle to the Hebrews. God, having spoken formerly to the fathers by the prophets at many times and in various ways, has in these last days spoken to us in the Son. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 2a, my translation. This introductory statement, umbrella-like, expresses a fundamental overall perspective on what the writer says in the rest of the document. At the same time, it is also fairly read for the sweeping and fundamental outlook it provides on God's entire special or saving self-revelation, in distinction from his general revelation in the creation and special revelation before the fall. Concerning that self-revelation, 4 interrelated factors are present in this statement, either explicitly or implicitly.